What is Florida's solution to reducing crime? Simple. Violate people's constitutional rights of freedom of movement and forcing them to leave the jurisdictions where they live. And this is the method that's Florida's preferred crime reduction method. Whether it's dealing with criminals or dealing with people that are homeless, the best solution that Florida has found to eradicating these problems is by forcing people to flee the jurisdiction they live in. And of course, that violates people's constitutional freedoms of mobility, of movement. The Lee County Sheriff's Office ran an entire campaign to warn criminals that they had to leave Lee County, Florida. Of course, I'm sure they were legally advised that this was not the right thing to do, and they've deleted all their posts related to this topic. But some of the news sources that covered it still have listed articles about their Leave Our County campaign, which is unconstitutional. And whether it's Manatee, Brevard, or Clay County, we've interviewed countless people who have told us that the sheriff offices have determined that they cannot live in a particular jurisdiction because they are homeless and they've been forced into adjacent jurisdictions. Counties like Manatee, Clay, and Brevard are doing this because they want to ensure that they can lower their crime rates, lower their homeless analytics, so that they can secure investments and convince people to move to those counties. However, the underlying problem originates in Manatee County, originates in Clay County, and originates in Brevard County. These are homegrown problems, and the solution of forcing people into other adjacent jurisdictions to release your county from their burden is somewhat unconstitutional, since those people, they have the right to decide where they want to live, whether they're homeless or they're a criminal. Yet we've seen Lee County, Brevard County, Clay County, Manatee counties, and many other counties throughout the entirety of the state of Florida decide that their solution to fix their analytics so that they can look good on paper is to violate people's civil rights and omit their constitutional rights to eradicate their crime problem simply by pushing it over into another jurisdiction. Law enforcement, local sheriff's offices do not have the legal right to determine where people live. However, many homeless people are finding that law enforcement is letting them know that they cannot live where they live and letting them know where they're forced to live because they're homeless or they have a criminal record. This is also unfair to adjacent counties that do not have a homegrown crime problem. Take the case of Manatee County and Brevard that are forcing other jurisdictions to take on their crime problem as they literally violate people's rights and force them to leave their jurisdictions. Sometimes even these counties are going as far as physically transporting people who are homeless or criminals into other jurisdictions so that the problem can become somebody else's. Like the case in Tampa, Florida that recently broke headlines where a local law enforcement agency decided to dump a homeless camp full of registered predators on Florida Department of Transportation lands, basically making a problem that was theirs belong now to another jurisdiction. And by this method that is now being registered and exposed throughout the entirety of the state of Florida, we're seeing how law enforcement agencies are diverting the problem and bringing it to somebody else's jurisdiction to appear like in their jurisdiction they're doing a good job. Violating people's civil rights and violating people's constitutional rights is not doing a good job. Providing opportunities for people who are homeless and criminals so that they can change their life path is no longer the priority. The priority now is simply to divert the problem to another jurisdiction and letting it be somebody else's problem. This is unfair to those jurisdictions because it's not their homegrown problem. Actual solutions is not the goal. The goal is just simply to make it look like you're doing better on paper, but in reality, in order to achieve their crime reduction goals, they're going beyond the law, beyond their powers, and violating people's rights. People who believe these crime reduction analytics then go on to move to these counties or invest in these counties. However, these counties have been unsuccessful for thousands of people. Take places like Pasco and Brevard that have had homegrown homeless populations that have reached into the thousands. The lack of opportunity that these counties have provided for the residents, they haven't invested in their communities, they haven't attracted businesses. All they've done is ran out the undesirable aspects, violating those people's rights. And in the meantime, these new people that are moving in, because they're seeing these crime reduction analytics, are led to believe that this place is actually improving and moving in the right direction. But what they don't know is that these counties have led to the absolute marginalization of entire segments of their populations, because there are no opportunities. People end up going to crime. People end up homeless because these places don't provide any opportunities. The state of Florida is literally raging a war against poor, homeless, and what they consider undesirable people. A lot of those people are native Floridians who have all the right to live in the state, but they're being outpriced, out-opportunityed, and outright forced out of the community they belong to by the pressure of developers. These developers are not only encouraging local law enforcement and other officials to make sure that analytics look attractive for investment, mostly their monopoly of single-family home construction, gas stations, storage facilities. We're not talking about actual infrastructure and actual places where people can get a job. Those things barely exist in Florida. Those types of investment only come into Florida when there's an oversaturation of labor force. In most markets, it's the need for employees that drives the desire of investing. But in the state of Florida, it's the oversaturation of a labor force that can be easily exploited and isn't going to make too many demands because of their economical necessity that drives company into investing in places where they know that the labor force is completely at their mercy. The situation in Tampa, where the Florida Department of Transportation ends up with a homeless problem on their properties, is a prime example of the types of methods that Florida agencies are using to divert their responsibility in handling these problems simply to another agency. And this happens perpetually, to where the homeless population and other undesirables are just simply pushed from one jurisdiction to the next to the next. Then you have agencies like Lee County, Florida, where their sheriff went on an entire campaign telling criminals that they're going to leave his jurisdiction or he's going to come and get them. Now, this campaign was registered by local news agencies, and we have reference articles, but for the most part, they've deleted most of the content as they become aware that this could actually lead them into some serious legal hurdles, because that is unconstitutional. But for the most part, most people in Lee County, Florida, saw at some point the sheriff's initiative to just literally decide that these people can no longer live in his county, because the solution to crime reduction isn't to provide opportunities and to reduce crime within your county. It's simply to divert the problem and let it be somebody else's now. You want to talk about being ineffective at your job when you divert your responsibilities to somebody else till you can say job accomplished. And sadly, it's not just a few agencies doing this. This is perpetually happening to the entirety of the state of Florida. And the jurisdictions, agencies that are last to make ordinances are the ones that are going to be stuck with a problem. So why are we telling you this? Well, the reason we're telling you this is because if you're moving to Florida or investing in Florida, you need to understand the manipulation of analytical information. These agencies are portraying that they're effective, but in reality, they're just diverting their responsibilities and problems onto somebody else. And if you decide to invest in one of these counties thinking that their analytical information is showing that the area is growing in the right direction, but what's really happening is that these agencies, municipalities, and areas are simply violating people's rights to make it look like they're doing their job. But in reality, they're not doing their job. Because these agencies are ineffective, these communities will eventually result back to the same crime and homelessness because it is a homegrown problem. And the reason it's homegrown is because they're not providing opportunities in real investments in these communities, which means that the next crowd of people that fills their void will suffer the same outcome: homelessness and criminal elements. Lee County, Florida, again makes a perfect example. The community of Pine Manor had several immigration raids. These immigration raids were supposed to remove the illegals who were criminals. Turns out that the people that moved into the community after these raids drove up the crime rate significantly, and they even had murders in the community, which had been absent for quite a while. I'm not going to tell you that this was a great community to begin with, but it wasn't a murderous place. The same thing happened in the city of Bradenton, where a small trailer park in a small area in the center of the city has seen 4 murders in a 2-month period in a small community that was predominantly Hispanic, and after SB 1718, they had a lot of people move into that community who were not from there. The Oneiko area of Bradenton also lost a lot of its population with SB 1718. What was then a thriving Hispanic community is now literally an open homeless camp where people rest on the businesses that were once thriving a few months ago. The laws and measures that the state of Florida is taking into effect are supposed to eliminate a problem, but in reality, they're creating a void which gets filled in sometimes with elements that are even worse than the ones that were present before. Just like California's gang injunction laws that force many criminals from California to move into adjacent states like Nevada and Arizona, the state of Washington has the lowest registered offender population in the United States, but those offenders move to adjacent Oregon, which now has one of the highest rates. The same thing Florida is doing with some of its laws and methods of operation to ensure that the undesirable elements that they don't want in their state end up in another jurisdiction or state. We're talking laws like the third strike, which means that once somebody has 2 felonies in Florida, they move to adjacent Georgia, South Carolina, or Alabama because they know that their third felony will likely lead them to life in prison. And the state of Florida is now also extending felonies to areas that before were not considered felonies, like felony trespassing. Trespassing simply means you're homeless and you're sleeping somewhere like an empty lot. Pasco, Brevard, Clay, Volusia, many of these counties in Florida, as well as cities like Melbourne, are starting to put up felony trespassing, a sign that would usually indicate that it's a construction site, to ensure that when somebody trespasses into these empty pieces of land, that they can be arrested for a felony. However, these are really not construction sites. In order to be a construction site, you would at least require a notice of commencement or a permit pulled for a development project, which none of these sites have, which means that they're charging a homeless vagrant person who's indigent with a crime of trespassing to the degree of a felony, knowing that the person is being charged with a crime that cannot really stand in court, but the person being charged is a vulnerable indigent person who cannot defend their rights. This unnecessary escalation of charges ensures that the victim, who's vagrant, transient, and indigent, is not going to try to put up a fight when they see these signs that they know do not hold any legal weight, but could cause a world of legal problems for them if these laws are somewhat enforced upon them or if they're charged with a crime. Regardless, most people waive their rights, and that is the method of this effort that Florida is doing. It's simply to intimidate somebody to waive their rights because of fear of escalation that they will not be able to pose a good defense in front of. As we know, that's possibly unconstitutional. However, this is the method that many counties that we've mentioned have chosen to ensure that they can escalate these charges to ensure that the homeless people are forced out of a jurisdiction and into another. In a vast majority of these Florida counties, law enforcement is engaging in destruction of property by destroying homeless people's tents without a warrant. That means that the land is private property and that the owner has not authorized that law enforcement agency to be a respectable agent to represent them, and that the law enforcement is acting out of their personal will, not in the defense of people's property, as is an obligation by law. These unwarranted evictions should go through a due process first, and law enforcement does not have the right to destroy people's personal property on private property when they're not an authorized agent to be there to begin with. However, when you have the rights of somebody who's homeless, indigent, or has a criminal record, and they're going up against law enforcement, they really do not stand too much in court. Whether it's a particular municipality or an entire state, when somebody decides to violate people's civil rights, many times the Supreme Court, in respecting state rights, decides not to get involved, which means that if a municipality, county, city, or even a state decides to do something that violates your constitutional rights, it's very unlikely that on a federal level you will be able to seek justice, especially since many of these states, like for example Georgia, which has their own Bureau of Investigation, or the state of Alabama, which has the FBI, but they operate with agents within the state and that have some type of ties to local agencies, means that many times even these federal resources or agencies are really working on a state level with state participation. Therefore, many times when your rights are being violated, there really is no legal action you can take, especially if you're indigent. The only thing we can infer from all this is that why would you want your local agencies where you live to be operating outside the law to accomplish their goals? Why aren't there legal avenues that can be operated, used to ensure community success? Why does your local agency have to go and now pervert the law to accomplish success or improvements in your community? Well, as we know, all these jurisdictions are battling with each other to appear on paper like they're doing a good job, and so much of it is not so much even what's happening within your particular municipality, but the exterior pressures of other municipalities that are doing things wrong. This has been putting unnecessary pressure on communities like Tampa, Orlando, and Jacksonville, where the adjacent municipalities are taking actions that are illegal, forcing the transient and criminal population to move into larger cities, not because that's where they prefer to be, but it's because these homegrown problems are forced out of their jurisdictions and become somebody else's problem. And that's the ideology that a lot of people have, but they fail to understand that within their own subculture, many misunderstandings are being perceived regarding these topics. Like the song from Jason Aldean, Not in My Small Town, or Not in My Town, which suggests that small town people have better ethics and morals than people in large cities. But when you talk to people in these large cities that are engaging in criminality, a lot of times they originated in a small town, yet they were forced to flee by law enforcement or by other agencies, and now they reside in a large city where they can fade in better and not be an outcast or a target of injustices. Many times, these large cities are simply the only place these people can hide from the persecution that they faced in other jurisdictions. This isn't a problem endemic only to Florida. We've seen California, Washington, and many other states engage in this type of behavior. But what's concerning about Florida is the scale at which it's happening in. When you take a county like Brevard, and they're systematically doing this to thousands of people, you now have an organized criminal racket, and those individuals that are participating become part of a conspiracy. Raymond Hicks, a retired police officer from Broward County, recently did a 2-hour interview series with Vlad TV in California that clearly explains how all this process that we're talking about has been systematically happening within Broward County, which is Fort Lauderdale, a large city. So large cities have this problem as well. In the time period of Raymond Hicks, much of this oppression was taking place towards the African American population. It has now shifted to be Hispanics, and predominantly homeless people, regardless of race, are now the new target of these types of misappropriations from agencies. As we have discovered on our channel, we've ran into burglary base camps, and these are operating both in suburban areas and in large cities, where much of the crime that takes place is actually due to homelessness and addiction. And even rural counties like Citrus and Pasco, they can attest to the reality that the vast majority of the crime that they face comes from these two groups. Ingles, Florida and Yankeetown, Florida even have a Facebook group that predominantly what you're seeing is homeless people trespassing, and how the community has put up cameras in places to ensure that they can catch the individuals who are doing these crimes. Ironically, this group also has a lot of racist content, mostly targeting African Americans, and it's interesting to see that in the hundreds of crimes that I've seen come across their Facebook group, I have not seen a single African American portraying these crimes. And there's a type of, again, subculture prejudice of misinformation, creating a perceived character of the antagonist of these problems that many times isn't the real perpetrator. And well, guys, that is today's video. As we have seen now, it's not just our YouTube channel, but other news agencies have started to see the same thing happening in Florida. This situation in the Tampa metropolitan area with the Department of Transportation and the homeless encampment actually made national headlines. As you guys know, in the state of Florida, in the recent months, I was the first person to start to dig into this topic. Right after I exposed this topic, we saw news agencies and other YouTube creators that have a much larger reach recycle my content with their own personal spin. And this isn't a new topic. This is beating a dead horse, because most of these Florida counties have reduced their homeless population by as much as 30 to 60%. We're really seeing the tail end of this situation. We're not seeing the height of this situation exposed. This has been covered up in Florida for years, and the problem was actually much bigger in the past than it is now. This isn't a new and arising problem in the state of Florida. We're seeing the end, the culmination of this problem take place now. Why then is it becoming headline news? It's up to your personal interpretation. But this isn't something new. This is something that's been ongoing in the state of Florida. I've started to cover it recently because I'm getting tired of seeing fake news stories exposed in Florida. Every time a new fake news story gets exposed in Florida, they put a spin on it that is so far-fetched from the truth that it makes me angry and makes me want to put out the truth, because as a resident of Florida, I've been knowing these things for a long time. I personally don't think homelessness in Florida is growing right now. We're actually seeing a smaller population of homelessness. What I am seeing, though, is that once I take these topics and expose them, other creators are running with my content, recycling it, and continuing to put these misleading spins on these stories. And really, I'm not focusing on one particular agency. I'm giving you guys a vast number of examples so that you can see that this is a much bigger problem embedded in a system that doesn't work, not so much in particular people who are doing something wrong. They go on to give their officers names like outreach officer. It makes it seem like they're going out there and they're reaching out to these homeless people to help them. But in reality, what they're doing is orchestrating a massive organized human rights, civil rights, constitutional right violation of these people's rights. And it's a complicitness where they do know the real numbers of homeless people. Take Manatee County, for example, which reports to Florida Health that they had 185 homeless people in their county. But they actually know the real number because they take pictures of each individual homeless person and create a profile for them that they have access to, so they know the real homeless problem and they know the real homeless population. However, they only depict and document those individuals who have multiple criminal charges so that they can portray their homeless population as a bunch of criminals and outlaws, while they are not documenting the people in a wheelchair that are living in the woods, simply living off of an SSI that's not enough to pay a rent. That's what they purposely overlook so that they can depict the general homeless population and depict them as only criminals and dangerous people to society. That is just my personal opinion. This video is nothing more than my personal opinion. Do your own research, do your own analytics, and try to understand not the numbers that are being published, but how much truth there is to those numbers and what incentive those people have to portray either a high number of one problem or a low number in the other. And if the actions that they're taking are targeting the root cause of the problem, or if they're just trying to portray that they're doing the job the way they're supposed to. Here's some results. Now we have less homeless people. Is it because we're helping them? No. Is it because we're providing them outreach? No. Is it because we're doing anything for them? No. It's because we violated their rights and now they had to move into another community. Problem solved. Congratulations, Florida.